for those who know, I'm an advisor for education, working very closely with Andy. So welcome everyone. I think we've got a very good morning kind of introduction to what we should really be thinking through when we're looking at the role of teachers and the role of educators in this uncertain and certain world. So I think you've all been selected to be in this room, not by your choice, but the reason you're all here is that because we believe that you could really only contribute to the question around teachers, the role of teachers in teacher transformation and certainty. So I'll try to speak very little as a chair. What the format is, we have an hour and a half, or less than that a bit. We have 4 speakers. I'll introduce them briefly, and each of them will have 10 minutes to speak, and then after that we'll open the discussions with everyone. And I think for our live feeding.
So we will be doing a Facebook live feed. Obviously one of the purposes of OXSCIE is to allow accessibility. So last year they had several thousand people who watched through social media. So for the speakers, when you speak, you will be on a Facebook live feed. I understand that you were made aware of this and that you're at least reasonably okay with that. And then when you are finished, I will turn it off so that when we have the discussion, people are free to speak as they would.
Thank you, and Duncan will also take the notes, so we will document every single thing here that everything is being talking about, but more the key points. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. So Nimet Rener is the director of the Aga Khan Education Services for the Aga Khan Development Network, and she oversees a network of over 200 Aga Khan schools and education programs across 13 countries. You can find more of her bio in the paper, more detailed. Stephen Farr is he co-leads the Teach for All Global Learning Lab, which seeks, supports and spreads insights for transformational classrooms in very marginalized communities around the world. And he's with us as well today. Thank you, Stephen. Sharath Jeevans is the founder and CEO of Stir Education, which reignites the intrinsic motivation of teachers and local officials within the education system to really improve the learning outcomes for children. And Baheta is the Chief Education for UNICEF in Kenya. So welcome everyone, and I think we'll start with Nimet, and then to Sharath and Steve and Daniel. We'll go in that order. So please, Nimet, over to you.
Thank you.
Take us.
So those who have good hearing can probably hear my heart pounding after the quality of the speakers this morning, which was absolutely awe-inspiring. And if I could draw enough bubble diagrams for how my brain was sparking around that, but also my heart moved. So when Andy and Nafisa invited me to speak today at the beginning of this session, and 10 minutes was only 10 minutes, and oh my God, 10 minutes? What do we capture in 10 minutes around all the things that I would wish to say? So I did what I feel I can do best, is to be as authentic as I can about how I really feel about the issue of teachers. I can put my director's hat on and talk to all of us about the major challenges we face as a not-for-profit, non-state sector school system, or wannabe school system, I would say, because right now we are spread in over 13 countries, schools in 10 countries, with over 100-year history of schools in these countries that have grown very organically over the years. And the lovely word that was used in one of the speakers about the fact that we are now increasingly in closer proximity of each other, our own schools are in closer proximity of each other. And so the reality of becoming a family, and you talked about the family piece this morning, all of these concerns for us are how do we become a meaningful family of schools that are spread over a globe? What are the things that will bind us together while allowing that beautiful diversity and the different contexts that exists? And the Aga Khan Education Services, I think, could be there amongst one who can claim to be intensely diverse. And what I mean by that isn't the reality of just the communities and the cultures that are reflected in the countries in which we operate, but our own history is hugely diverse. We have the reality of post-Soviet, post-conflict, post-colonial. Our geographies are incredibly diverse, from mountain regions to desert to coast rural, urban, peri-urban, and the profile of our students, even in terms of their economic profiles, also vary. As does, therefore, the types of schools that we offer, from a tiny little remote multi-grade school in a valley in northern Pakistan to a very dense, intense urban school in, for example, Karachi or Mumbai. So the task at hand is, how do we become a cohesive school system which has at the heart of our organization the valuing of pluralism, and genuinely recognizing the value and the strength that pluralism gives. Now, focusing therefore on the story of teachers, as we aim to become a school system that's relevant to the communities and the students that we serve, and all the challenges that we're talking about today. Uncertainty, of course uncertainty, but uncertainty for me can be, as our speakers presented this morning, a cause of great concern and paralysis and panic and anxiety. I've been blessed with a half-cup full mentality and actually believe in finding opportunity in that. And I say that because my background is in early years, and as a mother and now a grandmother, my deep, deep, deep desire for children to have hope in their lives is the driver, I think, for me. So when I come to, therefore, when we hear all the research telling us that no school is better than the quality of their teachers, and the pressure put on teachers, they become the scapegoat when things don't go well, the demands on teachers is enormous. And just thinking about the stress that teachers are under, the expectations that are put on teachers. And I have not met a teacher yet who doesn't genuinely come to work wanting to do a good job for her or his children. And predominantly for us within AKES, our teachers are women. And most of them come from rural areas where they themselves are the homemaker, they have other dependents, so they have, on top of the children that they are there to serve and care for, their burden of care is enormous. And I almost, when I engage with my heart around the work we have at hand and look at the spectrum of teachers that we support, many of them will not have been as well trained as some of the teachers that we know in countries that have a well-defined pre-service. Some of our teachers may not have completed their formal education. And yet they are required, in the pressure from the parents who send their children, that our children will do well in the exam. And the focus isn't about learning, it isn't necessarily always about preparing relevantly, it is about the exam. So there are dichotomies and tensions and what should I say, contradictions in what we're trying to do. So in my role as director, and I'm fortunate to have a team, not only my own team within AKES, but a wider family of AKBN colleagues, to say, how do we make sense of all of this in terms of where do we begin? Do we train all our teachers now so they all have the right content? Do we do what seems to be happening with every project we have, is train them in pedagogy and active learning? And it's like, yes, of course, that's important too, but that doesn't seem to be working fundamentally. And I go back to an experience I had at the age of 27 as a new mother. And I was the head of a daycare center. And like many new moms in that state of total, I have no idea what happened. I have lost all confidence. I don't even know how to go shopping with a baby. And how are these parents turning up to school, having had breakfast, with clean clothes on, and still functioning? I was in that moment, and this very wise nursery assistant found this little ad in the newspaper and said, Nimet, there's a parenting support group. Why don't you go along? It's round the corner in the local church. So at that, and I bless her to this day, because she'd seen new mom syndrome of when you lose, all sense of competency in doing anything. And off I went. And this marvelous facilitator just listened. And I remember at 27 years old experiencing something that I thought every child should have this. every child should be seen in this way, non-judgmentally, and just seen. And fortunately, I must have had that sort of default, because he saw something in me, encouraged me to train. And as the training went on, the focus for me became on what is going on in the space between the adult and the child that is nurturing, that allows for them to settle so that learning can happen. And there's been a lot of discussions today on the impact of stress. And we all know when we have an experience where we might be hurt, or someone just said something, or there's bigger issues at home, or there is tension, the ability to think clearly is reduced. I mean, the saying, I'm so upset I can't think clearly, is actually a really, really profound throwaway statement that's often made. And I asked myself about the whole task of learning and student spaces for learning, which is where do we pay attention first to beginning to create that space where children can breathe, feel emotionally safe, so that they can engage in that wonderful business of learning. And learning for children is full of uncertainty. They have no idea what they're going to stumble on next, but they go in it with that full-heartedness, and they do that. So my question to us around teachers, and when we talk about teacher transformation, is what support and how are we actually firstly providing teachers with that kind of a nurturing and listening and the skills that they have, so that they themselves can create an emotionally safe space for children to actually work in. It's not an easy thing. Stephanie Jones talked about the need to self-manage, and she gave that lovely, very honest, candid example of what happens to her when she gets home. That is a reality for teachers over and over and over again. And my big quest right now is we can do all the PD we want. We can do all the fantastic training and accountability and assessments, all necessary, all relevant. But the big question that stems now is, what do our policies do to actually begin to say, how are we enabling teachers to teach? What's the infrastructure that surrounds teachers that actually puts them at the center of our priority? Have we enabled school leaders to actually notice when that teacher just needs that one moment to say, it's been rough with the 3 kids today, and that moment of his or her internal voice saying, it has been, brings us back to our center. This need to see and be seen and understood is one of the most powerful interactions that I've noticed happen to bring people back to their internal resources. And so for us within AKES, while we have enormous structural issues, the big question around who supports the teacher, what are we doing to enable teachers to teach? And it's not teach the cognitive aspects, but create the learning spaces for children to actually be safe to teach. And for that, I believe teachers, school leaders, and you can never talk about teachers without talking about parents. It's that same level of a sort of recognition that what we're doing is not easy, and that we need each other, and it's about a heart connection that says we need to start firstly with giving ourselves enough goodwill to know everyone is doing the best they can, and that we need to pay attention to the heart of the matter. So I've run out of time, but I think you get the gist. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nimet, for sharing the challenges of the day-to-day work in schools, but also from your own personal experience and some of these key questions that I think you and the network of system and the Aga Khan Development Network in large are trying to think through and really address, and hopefully we'll hear more from others on how they are looking at these issues as well in their own experiences. And with that, I'd like to maybe Sharath to kind of share with us some of
Thanks, Nafisa. And I think I'll build on actually what Nimet said, and great to see so many friends in the room here as well. And Dr. Andy, of course, as well. So big well done. Yes. So as when Nafisa gave me the prompts for the session, I was just grappling, and there's such big ideas. There's inequality, poverty, prejudice. So how do you respond to that? And I was just racking my brains to think, what's the right way of thinking about this problem? And I thought I would go to a story actually, which a couple of you might have heard before, but love to retell it, which really inspired stir. And that's a story of a boy called Praveen, who was a boy in Uttar Pradesh, and 7 years ago he became one of the first children in his village to actually be able to go to school. But 7 years later, he found himself, like most kids in India now, unable to read or write a single paragraph in Hindi, unable to add or subtract two numbers. And on his last day of school, Praveen's dad, who'd never been to school himself, finally plucked up the courage to walk into the school, walked into his classroom and spoke to Praveen's teacher. And he told him, "You failed me. I thought my son's life would be better than mine." To which Praveen's teacher simply shrugged his shoulders and replied, "The son of a donkey will always be a donkey. The son of a donkey will always be a donkey." And that's a story in a way of a teaching profession that's lost its moral purpose in many of the countries you work in, and the story of about 750 million kids around the developing world who are in school now but not learning and fundamentally let down by their teachers in many regards. And in a strange way, I think rather than think of these big global ideas, what happens, I think building what Nimet said, what happens in the classroom between the teacher and the child really is in many ways the civil rights movement of our time. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of wondered why was there such social distance? How could a teacher behave that way? In India, as in many parts of Africa, for example, the idea of a guru is thousands of years old. You would go and live with your teacher for years. They would literally be your mentor. How do we devalue that as we got towards universal enrollment, for example? How did teaching become a babudom in India, or kind of bureaucrat's role rather than a genuine calling? And that's the stuff we're trying to figure out at the organization I run called Stir Education. We're trying to say, can you rekindle that? Is there a way to bring back what we call the intrinsic motivation to teach, so that teachers love teaching, they fundamentally believe in all of their children, and they want to genuinely become the best professionals they can possibly be, building perhaps in the footsteps of Andrea, for example, in that regard. And we're trying to do that at a fairly large scale. We're working this year with 200,000 teachers, and about 6 million children are being directly impacted by this sort of model. And after a lot of figuring out, what we realized that the most effective thing we could try and do was not look at things like pay, because those things are already being addressed in countries like India. How can we bring back ideas around autonomy? So this idea that as a teacher, you can really fundamentally make a difference to your child's life. The idea of mastery, you can actually become a better and better professional. You get supported to do that. And the idea of purpose, you're not sitting alone in a hot, dusty classroom. You're part of a bigger movement for change among the teaching profession. And we use a model of teacher networks, the kind of local ongoing communities of practice, that enable teachers to come together every month, get exposed to evidence of what can work in the classroom, but really clearly we don't tell them what to do. They actively work together to say, how will I apply that evidence on classroom routines or engaging every child in a way that makes sense for their context. They decide an action plan, they go off and do it, come back a month later, reflect on those kind of results. And what we've been realizing about this is that to make our approach really effective at scale, we also have to get the system around them to be supported, to have the same beliefs in every child. So we work now increasingly with district officials to really make sure they are supporting teachers. They now run the teacher networks. So the cost per child now has fallen to about 50 US cents per year, because we can use the existing system to run this. And I think what's exciting about this, I think, is really what we're trying to look at in our research agenda now. What are the transmission effects of an intrinsically motivated teacher and official to the child? The teacher often is the only serious role model in a young child's life, at least has gone to school or been educated. What will that do, for example, for the child's sense of curiosity, of growth mindset, of confidence and belief? And how does that rekindle or kindle a genuine love towards lifelong learning as really the end goal of what we're trying to do overall for the child? So again, in that age of uncertainty, they can respond. So I think just to kind of sort of close off my thoughts on this question, it's really about that transmission, that I was building on what Nimet said, that idea between the teacher and the child. That civil rights movement is happening now in millions of classrooms, day in, day out, rather than sort of big ideas around pluralism, inequality, etc., at a very abstract level. And just reminded, there was a really famous study done actually once in a state in India where there was an enormous increase in female empowerment that happened in that state. And no one was quite sure what happened exactly. And they looked at lots of effects, and could have been change in leadership, etc. It was highly correlated, they found, to actually cable television in those villages, which actually showed Indian and Brazilian soap operas, where there were many more female protagonists. to a very mundane explanation for a massive fundamental social change in terms of employment, women's roles in the workforce, etc. And I think there's something similar here with these ideas, that really what we can try and do, it really happens day to day in the mundane reality of the classroom. How can we, building on Nimet said, put teachers at the center of that, support them, give them that belief, again, that really every child can learn, and they really, really genuinely want to achieve their potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharath. Thank you, everybody. My name's Stephen Farr. It's an honor to be with a group like this. Andrew, I've seen your videos. It's fun to see you in 3 dimensions. I know there's no such thing as best teachers in the world, but it's an honor to have you in the room for the conversation. I feel like, first, the caveats. I feel I'm at a moment of real reflection. I've spent a lot of time asking this question myself, and I think that if I was sitting in this room 10 years from now, I would not buy anything I'm about to say. So that's where I'm coming from. It's just sort of a journey. I work for Teach for All. Some of you probably know programs like Teach First in the UK, Teach for Nepal, Teach for China, and Enseña Chile. There are 48 countries have these independent organizations. I work for the organization that seeks to accelerate learning among them. And I co-lead, as Nafisa said, a shop called the Global Learning Lab at Teach for All, and that's our job, is what can we learn from transformational classrooms and communities in the marginalized and frankly, historically and contemporaneously oppressed communities where these teachers are teaching. I'd like to start by just sharing our starting premises, where we're coming from, so you have a lens for the so-called answers I have to the question that Nafisa posed. Our starting premises are, first, that we as humanity face existential challenges. I think we got a dose of that this morning. They're global. They're no longer local. I won't go through all of it, but it's scary. Right? We also are sitting in a world where there's enormous opportunity for technology and innovation. That's premise 1, is that education has to be at the center of our conversation about, are we going to survive on this planet as a species? Premise number 2 is that we have radical mismatches between education systems and children. And this morning, the theme of those was, I think, just one of several mismatches. It was this future we're looking toward is uncertain. And the education system we have was built in an industrial age. We know that narrative, absolutely. But there are other mismatches, right? We got a little of it from Dr. Johnson. We've learned more about how the human brain works in the last 20 years than in all of human history, and yet we're still working with classrooms and schools and systems that were built before we understood that. There has to be a mismatch there, right? And then there's a fundamental one. This is the part where it's taken me a long time to see with clear eyes. We are all working in classrooms and schools and systems that were built for rich white boys. I go around the world to communities, and the more I learn, the more I see, wait a minute, this system was imposed on this community. It did not come out of the values and vision of that community. It was built for assimilation. It was built for trying to change the definition of we to someone from the outside. Almost everywhere we go. That realization, I think, has enormous implications. I think when we are truly honest, if there's people on Mars or what are Martians studying us for 1,000 years, and they say, what's the purpose of education? They are going to say, education is how we maintain divisions of power and privilege on planet Earth. That's what it's been doing, right? It's not an accident. That's what it's been doing. And so when we start with that premise, the idea that we need to perfect the systems we have just feels horrible. No. If we perfect the systems we have, we are going to perpetuate the divisions of power and privilege that we're all living into right now. That takes me to a pretty dark place. But then there's this light, right? This is the third premise, which is what you all have said. There is so much wisdom in marginalized and oppressed communities, in the students and families and communities who every single day are navigating those histories of oppression, to find ways to fulfill potential that many of us in these rooms or on these campuses are not hearing and not listening to. So what we have to do, and this is the driving spirit of the Global Learning Lab, is we have got to acknowledge that there is not a map to this paradigm of education that will actually fulfill the potential of children in all of these different contexts. There's a lot we know and a lot we can push off of, but we have to be learners. We have to learn our way forward toward this together. And if there was one thing I would bring to this conversation about transforming teacher, I mean, it flows exactly with what you all have said. We have got to treat our educators as learners. We have to learn together. We are not filling empty vessels. We are trying to create space so that we can see what's actually working in the context in which it's working. Right? If I hear what works one more time, I mean, I truly believe in it, and I spent most of my career trying to make the map of what works. We have to interrogate that question. It's what works for whom, in what context, and above all, to what end? What is the purpose of education that we're aspiring to? So that's where I'm coming from, and I just will very quickly share like how we're coming at this. The Global Learning Lab, we have programs in 48 countries, thousands of teachers working with hundreds of thousands of students, almost exclusively in marginalized, oppressed communities, and we're looking to understand what's happening out there. Why are they doing what they're doing? We organize ourselves around 4 questions. It won't be surprising. Why are those teachers and students and families doing what they're doing? Who is deciding the purpose of education in those contexts? What are they doing? And how are they growing? The way we pursue those questions is we create spaces for learning. Give a couple of examples. We host things we call learning loops. I have the ridiculous privilege to travel around to these countries and see classrooms that would just blow your mind, right? They're just, children's lives are changing in Pooja's classroom in what some people would call a slum in India. Children's lives are changing in the mountains of Peru in this classroom. We create virtual visits, we create video of those, and then we bring together people from all different cultural perspectives to watch those several classrooms and ask what can we learn from them. And it's amazing. The first 30 minutes, you know what we talk about? We talk about how different those classrooms are. Oh, this one has 70 kids, and this one has 3 kids, and this one has chalkboards, and this one has whatever. But 30 minutes into it, what we're realizing is, in the ways that matter, those transformational teachers are more like each other than they are the teachers next door to them in their countries. That they are doing things different to the systems around them, but like each other. That's such an important realization. And when we bring those teachers together, they're always saying, oh my gosh, it is so nice to be surrounded by people who are feeling like if I'm doing what I need to do by my kids, I have to subvert and resist some things about the system that I'm in. Right? That's where we're trying to learn, is how do systems need to change to make this easier for everybody. We host roundtables, we host network learning teams where we take people to different countries. That's how we learn. I just want to end with kind of over-distilled headlines from some of the learning on those 4 questions. When we study these transformational classrooms on the question of purpose, what we see is teachers and students and families putting the question of what are the ultimate aims of education right at the heart of the classroom experience in a school. And they're treating it as a process, not a product. This is the place where 10 years ago I would have looked at myself and said, what are you talking about, right? We know the purpose of education. You've got to learn to read, write, and do math. You've got to get into higher education so you can get a good job. The absence of conversation about purpose, to your point, I mean, it's just undermining our progress. I would challenge us all in this, like, to what end? And that goes to the second question, who decides that? Historically, it has not been the students, families, and communities that are experiencing education. And how do we have those people together to decide that? So why purpose? 2, that this has to be, we call it locally rooted and globally informed. 3, what are they doing? They're focusing on broader student outcomes, especially agency and student social political awareness. They're teaching differently. They are turning learning over to children. The learning is actually happening. It's discovery learning. And then maybe most important, how are they growing? They're not being told what to do. They're not being given a scripted curriculum. They're not, I mean, I spent years developing a rubric. They're not like following the rubric. What they're doing is being autonomous. what they're doing is connecting to students and purpose, and then they are innovating. They are saying, we're going to get there, and if it means that I have to do something that my head of school said I shouldn't do, I'm going to find a way to do it. When we learn from them, I think that's how we transform teaching. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Stephen, it's really difficult to follow you, but I will do my best. My name is Daniel Baheta. I am the Chief of Education in UNICEF Kenya Country Office. In this room, I see awesome friends. Madam Soad, you're hiding there. A colleague and somebody who really is a role model to me is in the room, so it's very difficult. And of course, Dr. Andrew in the room, so I feel.
You should have
don't. But I'm gonna focus my talk around 3 areas. One, I'm gonna tell you a personal story. 2, I'm gonna talk about why, to answer the question I was asked. I'm a good student and I'm a good teacher, so I'm gonna answer the questions to the best of my knowledge using Kenya as an experience. And number 3, I'm gonna suggest maybe 2 or 3 things we need to do immediately. And I think we have very limited time. And thanks to our presenter this morning, he has utterly challenged us, depressed and impressed us at the same time. So I think it's important to also act together. So my personal story is, I come from a place called Ethiopia, originally born and raised in Ethiopia. At age 14, I became a refugee. I left the country. But the most critical point I want to mention is my teachers. When I was a little kid, the teachers that inspired me stayed with me until today. Everything I do is because those teachers in the continent of Africa, in public school, run by government officials during a very brutal regime, I was a student and I learned, and therefore I am here. Because if I was not in that school, I would not have had this opportunity to be here. So I think those teachers matter. So when we talk about reform, remember those teachers, they were probably not paid. If they were paid, they were paid very little. But I'm also very privileged in so many ways. As a young refugee, I went from Ethiopia to Kenya, from Kenya to Italy, and then from Italy to Canada, and then from Canada to Japan. That part was a choice. But I am a student of all these places. I have great teachers through my journey, and I've experienced, likely, the school system of Africa, Kenya, which is also another African country, Italy, a very wonderful experience. That's why I talk with my hand right now. Of course, one of the greatest education system, Canada. And then, of course, when I did my first degree, I decided why not. I became a teacher and I went to teach English in Japan. And then I also did my master's and PhD in Japan. So I don't want you to be impressed because it was not my intelligence, it's necessity, but I've done my master's and PhD in Japan as well, in Japanese. So I've experienced multiple types of teachers, multiple types of education system. It's not by choice I became interested in the education. And I am, and I continue to be a teacher because I was in the classroom. I have taught in Canada, I'm a teacher now in Kenya in so many ways. I've taught in Japan, and I've taught also in Africa. So when I did my PhD studies, I was an assistant teacher also at the University of Asmara. So, can we transform teachers? What is the role of a teacher? To be honest with you, currently we're doing curriculum reform in the continent. But I want to tell you this. If I was given the opportunity today to compare the education system in England and the education system in Kenya, in rural Kenya where Annie and I met, in the rural part of Sudan where Madam Soad and I work, if we compare that education system to your education system, we have no chance. We stand no chance because your children have all the opportunity and